That was heavy, wasn't it? And the year was 1985. Just for the context, 18 years after we had the first human heart transplant, and 16 years after the man walked on the moon. Yet in the medical profession, across the hospitals, across the continents, we accepted that babies don't feel the scalpel. It wasn't one or two people who believed this, it was actually the teaching. And it was based on certain beliefs. If the patient can't express their mental state, you can't prove it exists, what was called behaviorism. And the other one was, if myelination of the nervous system was not complete, then the pain signals cannot be transmitted. Thankfully, these beliefs have moved away now. So in this video, let's talk about how to manage pain in the newborn baby. I'll go through step-by-step approach to the management of pain. But before doing that, let's go through some of the myths that we harbor regarding neonatal pain and debunk them. Welcome to Tiny Tot. My name is Dr. Shivashankar and I'm a neonatologist. Let's dive in. Let's look at the first myth. Preterm babies don't have mature nervous system to feel pain. So for pain signal to be transmitted, you need the peripheral and central nervous system to be developed. You need the connections to be established between the peripheral nerves, the spinal cord, the thalamus, and the cortex, right? And if you look at the fetal development, by 20 weeks, all the connections are well established. And by 23 weeks, you've got mature nerve endings and fully formed spinal cord projections ready to receive the signals. So the machinery for pain is already in place even before the baby is born. Now, this 23 weeks is where we resuscitate the babies. We intubate, we insert lines, the chest drains, and all the invasive procedures. So this myth is busted. Then people often say that these invasive procedures are life-saving. True, there's no doubt about that. But they also sometimes say that these stresses are short-lived and babies can't remember, so there are no long-term consequences. And that is not true. Because conscious memory isn't the point here. The nervous system remembers and the body remembers. Studies show that babies who go through repeated painful stimuli early in life develop hypersensitivity to a variety of sensory stimuli later on in life. A touch sensation may register as painful stimuli. For example, in babies who are born to diabetic mothers who got repeated heel pricks for monitoring blood glucose and other things, they showed much more intense response to venipuncture later on in their life. And neuroimaging studies have shown that there is increased pain-related activity in preterm brains compared to term babies who didn't go through the same exposure to pain. And the next one is even more worrying. The volumes of amygdala and thalamus are reduced in preterm babies who have had more invasive procedures. We all know these structures are crucial to how we experience the world. The long-term picture follows from all of this. Memory impairment, effect on psychosocial behavior and cognition, etc. So there are long-term consequences. Now the other concern people have is it is difficult to assess pain in babies. Yes, there is a grain of truth to it because there is no gold standard and babies can't tell us. But it doesn't mean that we cannot assess pain. There are surrogate methods that we use such as physiological responses like heart rate, saturations, etc. and the behavioral ones like facial expression, limb movements, etc. And there are validated tools to assess pain such as PIPS, NIPS, NPAS, CRICE, etc. Are there any challenges to pain assessment in babies? I won't deny there are. There is inter-observer variability, and babies with neurological illness can be harder to assess. And most of the tools I mentioned above are actually validated for acute pain and post-operative pain and not for chronic pain. But here is the most important headline, the one that I want you to take away from this video. A multi-center observational study showed that pain assessment increases the odds of receiving analgesia. So if you measure it, you're more likely to treat it. And if you don't measure it, babies are more likely to remain in pain and not receive any pain relief at all. Okay, we have talked about why it matters. Now let's look at the scale of the problem because it is much more bigger than we imagine. There are 15 million babies born premature every year in the world. It's more than the population of Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, Tunisia, just to name a few. And on an average, the term babies requiring admission to NICU spend about 4.9 days. But an extreme preterm baby spends about 81 days in the NICU. And here is the big ticket item. An extreme preterm baby has on average about 14 painful procedures done every day. 14. If it's on such a big scale and if it matters so much, we do need to do something, right? So how can we approach this? Let's look at the step-by-step approach to the management of pain in the newborn babies. And this is the framework we need to come back to every time for every procedure. Let's look at each of these steps in detail. The first step is we can't treat what we haven't measured, and we have covered what tools we have earlier in the video. So the real question is, when do we assess? It has to be before any painful procedure to get a baseline, and during and after to see how the baby has responded and confirm the intervention has worked or if it needs to be escalated. And for babies who are on ventilatory support or in the post-operative period, regular pain scoring should be part of the routine nursing observation, just like we record any other vital parameter. The step 2 is, once we have assessed, we need to ask what kind of painful procedure are we dealing with, because not all procedures are the same. And broadly, they fall into 3 categories. The first one is minor bedside procedures, your heel pricks, your venipunctures, NG tube insertions, tape removals, ROP screening, etc. Then you have major bedside procedures such as intubations, lumbar punctures, chest drain insertions, etc. And finally, you have the post-operative pain. But even before we reach for any pain relief tool, there is one important question that is worth asking. Does this procedure have to happen right now? Because the best way to treat pain is not to cause it in the first place at all, isn't it? And can it be bundled with other interventions? Don't disturb the baby 4 times when you can do it just once. Use indwelling lines where possible. I've seen sometimes heel prick being done even when there is umbilical arterial line. Use non-invasive monitoring such as transcutaneous PCO2. It will reduce the number of blood tests we need to do. And the next step is, if the intervention is necessary, then the next step is where we always start. And honestly, this is the part which probably is underused. The first one is maternal contact. So let's start with breastfeeding. The Cochrane review confirms its benefit in reducing the pain. Part of it is due to proximity to the mother, skin-to-skin contact that leads to the release of endorphins and oxytocin, and part of it is due to the analgesic effect of sugars and fat in the breast milk itself. And direct breastfeeding is better than giving breast milk by the bottle. So if the mother is at the bedside and the baby can feed, ask her to breastfeed where possible during the procedure. The second option we have is kangaroo care. This was originally introduced for warmth and bonding, but we now know that it does much more. It decreases crying time, improves pain scores during minor procedures, and it is safe in preterms who are stable. And there is benefit for the mother too. It reduces the pain due to perineal tear during vaginal delivery. And the third option we have is facilitated tucking and swaddling. Both are more effective than no intervention at all. But we need to be careful about one thing. Tight swaddling increases the risk of hip dysplasia. And the fourth option is non-nutritive sucking. Studies show that pacifier during procedure lead to decreased crying and smaller heart rate response. The fifth one is sensorial saturation. This one is slightly offbeat. The concept is that you use multiple sensory inputs at once, such as touch, massage, familiar smell, and voice during a painful event. The downside to this is it's quite labor intensive, and the right dose of stimulation isn't easier to decide. But if you have the staffing and the protocol, you should consider using it. Now, the last one in this is the big one. It is sucrose, the workhorse for minor acute pain. It is given orally and works with the release of endogenous opioids. The Cochrane review gives you a definitive answer. The crying time goes down, pain scores go down, physiological responses are dampened, and pain-specific facial expressions are decreased. It really does work. A few practical points to remember. The exact dose is not established. It's anywhere between 0.05 to 0.5 ml of 24% depending on the gestation of the baby. So work within your unit guideline. You can give it directly into the mouth or use it on a pacifier. Both works. The timing matters here though. You need to give it about 2 minutes before the procedure, and the effect lasts for about 4 minutes. So you plan the procedure around that window. Interestingly, it doesn't work beyond the neonatal period. One word of caution here, the long-term effects of repeated dosing in very preterm babies is not fully established yet. So be cautious if you have to use it too frequently. Now let's come to pharmacological strategies. When non-pharmacological measures aren't enough, or when the procedure makes pharmacological analgesia mandatory from the start, such as major bedside procedures or post-operative state, then pharmacological interventions are necessary. There are 2 layers in this. One is topical, other one is systemic. Let's look at EMLA first, which is a mixture of lidocaine and prilocaine. When applied topically, it can reduce the pain during lumbar puncture, venipuncture, and arterial puncture. And it's used commonly in pediatrics, but somehow we don't use it so much in NICUs. But it's important to remember that it doesn't work in heel prick or in intramuscular injections. Then there is paracetamol. We use it in NICU for more than one reason, not necessarily for pain. But Cochrane review tells two important things. On its own, paracetamol isn't effective for acute severe pain, so don't use it as a monotherapy for pain relief. But paracetamol has a morphine sparing effect in postoperative pain, which matters because it lets us use less opioid. So practically use it in combination along with an opioid, either IV or oral when you can, but don't use rectal because they aren't reliable. Now morphine, it is the most commonly used opioid in NICU. It is given either as a continuous infusion or bolus. Evidence tells us that it improves ventilator synchrony and provides sedation and reduces pain score. But there's a big but here. Very preterm babies on morphine take significantly longer to reach full enteral feeds and a lot longer to come off the ventilator. And there are some concerns about increased risk of IVH as well. So morphine is a mixed bag. The bottom line is that routine use of continuous morphine in every ventilated preterm baby does not actually do much benefit. Now that doesn't mean that morphine doesn't have a role at all. It absolutely does. In postoperative pain or in individual babies where clinical judgment dictates that benefits are more than the risk. One more opioid that we commonly use is fentanyl. It gives rapid analgesia with minimal hemodynamic effects, but it causes respiratory depression and prolonged ventilatory course. So again, it's not recommended for routine continuous infusion in preterm babies. But fentanyl is useful in procedures such as intubation because of its rapid onset of action. Then there are three more pharmacological agents that we need to talk about briefly. Number one is NSAIDs, not used in NICU. Number two, midazolam. It has only minor analgesic effect but causes respiratory depression and hypotension and is neurotoxic. Hence, it's not recommended in preterm babies. And the third one is dexmedetomidine. This is the new kid on the block. It's a potent medication with minimal respiratory depression, but the neonatal data is sparse and there are some reports of bradycardia and seizure. So again, routine use is not recommended. Finally, in this section, one more important note on opioids. The therapeutic window is very narrow, so it's easier to slide into toxicity range, so watch out. And also the clearance of fentanyl from the body is much longer in newborns, about 10 hours in term and a lot longer in preterms. So be aware of these issues while making decisions on opioids. Finally, we come to the last step in our approach, and probably the most important of all. All these tools are most effective when used together rather than alone. So at the bedside, the question isn't really about this or that. It's about what's the right combination and in what order. Here are some of the rules to remember when combining these strategies. Number one, start with the broadest and the safest layer and only add upwards as the procedure demands. So start with a non-pharmacological measure, then add sucrose, and then add topical anesthesia when indicated, and finally add a systemic agent where the procedure really demands it. For example, for heel prick, do cluster care and combine many activities together to reduce the number of interruptions to the baby. Then look for breastfeeding or skin-to-skin contact with the mother or facilitated tucking, and then give sucrose. But for post-operative analgesia, we need to use opioids. But more importantly, start using paracetamol as a regular medication and not as PRN from the very beginning. And the second rule is to get the timing right. While using sucrose, wait for 2 minutes before you start the procedure. And for local anesthetic, give adequate dwell time before the procedure. And for opioids, again, especially when you're intubating, wait for the medication to act before going ahead with the procedure. We started this video with Jeffrey Lawson and his experience during surgery, narrated by his mother Jill. Jill didn't stay quiet. She spoke, she wrote, and she refused to let the profession look away. And in part because of her, and in part because of the wonderful work by researchers like Anand and others, the way we care for babies in pain has changed. In 1987, 2 years after Jeffrey's death, the American Academy of Pediatrics stated that it was no longer ethical to perform surgery on preterm babies without anesthesia. And the American Pain Society later established Jeffrey Lawson Award for Advocacy in Children's Pain Relief in his name. It's not perfect yet. Somewhere in the world, there is still a preterm baby getting a heel prick without any pain relieving measure. There may still be a team who don't have pain assessment tool at the bedside. There may still be a baby coming back from theatre with less analgesia than they actually need. That's why we need to keep talking about this. If you're someone who look after a newborn baby, part of our job, alongside everything else, is to be that person who takes pain seriously in a patient who can't say, "Mummy, it hurts," but can feel. And we can do something about it. If you found this useful, do leave a comment and share it with a colleague if you think it's appropriate. I'll see you in the next one.